The reading in the textbook has quite a large number of minerals. As I mentioned in the last presentation on vitamins, I'm just going to hit on some key ones, but still read about all of them. Minerals are inorganic and they are essential for human survival. What a mineral will do is or the role is stabilize enzymes, stabilize proteins, serve as cofactors for enzymes. It's involved in cell binding sites on the cell surface, stabilization, so many things that minerals do. Minerals do not have a caloric value, but they all carry a charge. And also of interest is in comparison to other substances, minerals are not degraded by cooking or digestion. Minerals are either major or minor, and the common trace iron, zinc, chromium, boron. There's quite a few common major minerals: sodium, potassium, and calcium. The electrolytes are important for fluid balance, blood pH, sending signals, nervous transmission, and we know that the sodium and potassium especially are important for fluid. And so we're going to take a look at them individually, but this just identifies some of the main functions of electrolytes. This identifies the specific electrolyte or the specific mineral and the role in humans, not just athletes, but in anyone. And also note that the RDA, or adequate intake, is also identified on this slide. If we look at sodium first, it's typically ingested as sodium chloride, and it is an extracellular electrolyte that plays a role in fluid balance. And if the sodium levels become extremely low, then we have difficulties maintaining our mean arterial pressure, or our blood pressure, body temperature, and really our biggest issue is not getting in enough sodium. We get in too much sodium. Our excess intake is about our intake is about 3,400 milligrams per day, and the upper limit for adults is 2,300 milligrams per day. So for most of us, sodium is not an issue. Potassium is an intracellular fluid, and it's involved in electrical impulse. We find it in bananas, potatoes, citrus fruits, vegetables, and milk. And if it is in the compartment where it is typically a low value, it can cause many problems. And one is hyperkalemia. K is the abbreviation for the molecular abbreviation. And so hyper is above, emia is blood, elevated blood potassium. That can cause arrhythmias, a lot of fatigue, and actually, depending on how elevated it is, it can cause death. So sodium as its role in the extracellular fluid, potassium in the inside of the cell, potassium on the outside of the cell. We know that we're more likely to lose sodium through perspiration. Now, the requirement for athletes that exercise in the heat, they sweat a lot, they tend to lose a lot of sodium in their sweat, and they exercise for a long period of time, they might be at risk for low sodium levels. And here you see a t-shirt that has the white markings on it. That's actually indicating sodium lost in the sweat. Magnesium is important for muscle function, and I'm mentioning this one quickly simply because it is one that's a little hard to keep to get sufficient amounts. It's found in whole grains, veggies, bananas, nuts, legumes, so beans, peas, pintos, navy beans, different variety of seeds. It has been shown to be beneficial for sleep, for cramping, for keeping people from wiggling around when they're sleeping, restless leg syndrome. So there is a role for magnesium, and in some cases it might be helpful to have a supplement. However, it's best to get it in your diet, and we do that by getting a variety. Calcium is necessary for our bones and our teeth, as you are well aware. We know that it is associated with vitamin D, and so getting enough vitamin D in your diet and calcium, both important for your teeth and bones. If we have insufficient calcium because of a diet low in dairy, low calorie diet, a person who is growing fast and not getting enough vitamin D and calcium, that can lead to osteoporosis. We tend to think of osteoporosis as being a disease of elderly women, but it can happen earlier, especially if individuals are really not sufficiently eating sources of calcium and not supplementing. Now there's calcium citrate and calcium carbonate as supplements. The carbonate is more alkaline, the citrate is more acidic. And the carbonate is more dense by weight with elemental calcium. The pills are smaller, and you can take it on an empty stomach, where citrate is acidic. And carbonate you have to take with food. Citrate you can take on an empty stomach because it's acidic already. You also have to take bigger pills. The calcium carbonate are bigger pills. I don't eat breakfast right away when I take my medications in the morning, so I take a carbonate. Good sources are dairy, foods that are enriched with calcium. You find that on an orange juice, for example, and notice that orange juice is acidic, so it's going to be absorbed. Green leafy vegetables, almonds. And so the amount that you take, if you do take a supplement, you separate it throughout the day. You can't take more than 500 milligrams at a time. It just will not be absorbed, and you want to have an acidic environment, and that's like stomach acid. That helps. And get sufficient vitamin D. Individuals' risk for insufficiency, as I mentioned, women in particular, postmenopausal women are more susceptible to it. The individuals that can't or won't eat dairy, have a very low calorie diet, are getting insufficient vitamin D, not getting enough calories. They maybe have gluten celiac disease or Crohn's for absorption issues, times of rapid growth. So kids, they're at risk for, and you live in a space where you don't get enough sun, so you get your vitamin D. We do lose calcium in sweat. So the athletes at risk are primarily women that have abnormal or no menstrual cycle. Those weight restricted sport where you've got a low caloric intake, or you have lactose intolerance. Now what's interesting, I'm going to still mention calcium. Calcium interferes with iron absorption. So one complication of a high calcium intake is also going to be iron deficiency. You need to take, if you have a calcium and an iron supplement, you want to separate them by about an hour to 2 hours. Iron is necessary for oxygen carrying capacity. If the hemoglobin is the structure that carries oxygen in the blood, iron is important in that structure. It's called hemoglobin. If it's in the muscle, it looks different. I'll show you that in a second. And so iron is really important for metabolic processes, especially with aerobic activities in particular. We can get iron from heme or meat, it's absorbed better, or non-heme, which is going to be your vegetables. Again, vegetarians are going to need to be very mindful that they're getting sufficient iron sources in their diet. Some individuals might be at risk due to their sport, or if an individual has, heavy menstrual bleeding, they're at greater risk, or younger athletes who have a higher requirement. Myoglobin has 1 subunit, hemoglobin has 4. Now I'm mentioning this because if somebody has a severe muscle trauma and there is myoglobin breakdown and a lot of myoglobin spills into the bloodstream, it's not normally there. It has to go to the kidney to be excreted. It can be very damaging to the kidney. It's called rhabdomyolysis. It is very painful, extreme damage to the kidney. That's where we need to be mindful in terms of injuries for athletes. If you're deficient, an iron intake will help. If you're not deficient, an iron supplement will not help for performance. Here are some example athletes, and they go along with the low body weight conditions, gymnastics, jockeys, ballet, big weight loss, difficulty with iron. Vegetarian diets, you gotta be mindful on getting those iron sources, and we do lose it in our sweat, so hot, humid environments can increase the iron intake. So the thing about supplements, should I take a supplement or am I going to get enough through food? Well, sometimes a nutrient is difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities of the diet because the athlete might not like those foods. And if you're like anyone, that everyone probably knows that person who has a very limited palate, knows at least one person. That would be an individual who would be a potential candidate for supplements. But we definitely want to have food as our first source. If somebody is low or deficient, a supplement is going to be important. So for instance, a vitamin D supplement, if you live in Michigan and you're a postmenopausal woman, might need to have some vitamin D in some greater quantities to kind of catch back up with what normal values are. So concentrated doses of some nutrients will be required if you're correcting a deficiency. We want to make sure we get supplements that are tested, that are safe, and sometimes we might need a supplement if there is a concern about our food sources or food hygiene. Maybe we need to, for traveling, for example, might need to have supplements. And the trace minerals that I didn't really talk about individually, as again, I have in previous semesters, but I think it's just fine to read about them. This is an example of a large number of trace minerals, which means that we need very little amount of it. How if there's a disruption or altered amount in the trace minerals, that it can influence or lead to the pathway of insulin resistance or diabetes. So look at that list. Magnesium, didn't mention anything about boron, but boron's involved. Selenium, chromium, cobalt, iodine, zinc. Those are trace minerals that you'll read about in your readings, and so it's important to pay attention to those as well. If you have a deficiency, eating or getting that supplement for the recommended amount can help performance. If you are at an appropriate level, it's not going to be beneficial. Above the recommended levels can be detrimental in some cases. Key vitamins to assess: D and B. Mentioned D in the vitamin chapter. And minerals: sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and iron, all good values to assess. And that is mineral. That is the mineral chapter.